Welcome to LitMovements, a series of podcasts about American realism, modernism, and postmodernism. This three-part series was created by Dr. Kristen Jacobson at Stockton College. The Office of the Provost, through the Summer Technology Academy, provided the training and funding for this project. Part 1. Realism. The first concept that I want to talk about is realism. The first thing you need to know about realism is when it happened. Realism is a movement of the latter half of the 19th century, roughly from 1870 to 1900. Perhaps the easiest way to think about realism is to think about it as a movement associated with photography. You really are trying to take a snapshot of that particular place or person. William Dean Howells provides one of the best short definitions of realism. He writes, "Realism is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material." Let's also listen to part of a definition from the Bedford Glossary. The Bedford Glossary says, quote, "A literary movement that developed in the latter half of the 19th century in America, England, and France in reaction to the excesses of Romanticism." But we still haven't really defined what is realism beyond the time period in which it takes place. Of course, we can always go to the literature itself to get an idea of what it means to write reality. Here's a short passage from A New England Nun by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. It comes from the beginning of the story. Quote, "It was late in the afternoon, and the light was waning. There was a difference in the look of the tree shadows out in the yard. Somewhere in the distance the cows were lowing, and a little bell was tinkling. Now and then a farm wagon tilted by, and the dust flew. Some blue-shirted laborers, with shovels over their shoulders, plodded past. Little swarms of flies were dancing up and down before the people's faces in the soft air." So from this opening description, we can begin to see how Freeman is trying to present a verbal snapshot. When authors do this to capture a specific region, and usually the use of vernacular speech is a good tip-off here, they are usually said to be a part of regionalism or local color. Sometimes these two terms, regionalism and local color, are used interchangeably. For the purposes of our class, we've been thinking about local color as more stereotypical type writing. Local color authors tend to employ stereotypes uncritically. Regionalism, on the other hand, tends to present a more nuanced picture of that local culture. The Bedford Glossary also points out, quote, "Writers associated with this movement tried to write reality." I want to pause here to really consider, what does it mean to write reality? At the risk of sounding a little bit too much like Jeff Foxworthy, let me say, you know you're reading a realist text when it was written first in the latter half of the 19th century, somewhere roughly between the dates of 1870 and 1900, and when it really tries to take a photograph of the people and place it's trying to represent. At this point, it may be helpful to actually look at a visual representation of realism and to connect that visual representation with some of the things that we've been seeing in the literature that we're studying. The first image that we're looking at is Whistler's Mother, painted in 1871. Just as we've asked of the literature of the late 19th century, we can ask of this portrait, what does it mean to be American? In what ways would you say Whistler's mother is distinctively American? In what ways does she represent assimilation? The portrait's presentation of events as they really are connect Whistler's mother to realism. We might also think of Whistler's portrait of his mother as an example of regionalism or local color. What are some of the ways in which you can connect this image to those literary movements in the literature we've studied? So what have we learned about realism in a short 5 minutes? First, it's a movement of the late 19th century. And second, it's a movement whose aesthetics try and capture reality. Movements associated with realism include naturalism and regionalism and local color. You know you are reading a naturalist text when the environment determines what happens to the protagonist. Texts coming out of the regionalism and local color movements are usually distinguished by, as their names imply, a focus on a particular region or on a particular culture, especially where the vernacular is used in the text. Of course, realism is alive and well today. While realism gives way to modernism in the early 20th century, it never fully disappears. In fact, in the late 20th century, writers such as Richard Ford and Jonathan Franzen are said to write neorealism, or dirty realism. Many writers continue to write reality. When they add a bit of the fantastic as part of the everyday, it's known as magical realism. Some scholars, for example, would place Toni Morrison's novel Beloved in this category because of the dead child's return. Of course, we can also see hints of the Gothic novel in Beloved too. But for a period that lasted from roughly 1870 to 1900, realism emerged out of the Civil War and the rise of industrial capitalist democracy. From Mark Twain to Charles W. Chesnutt to Sarah Orne Jewett and Zitkala-Sa, many regionalist and realist writers sought to capture agrarian rural culture before it disappeared.